The rain fell in a steady rhythm as Barack Obama sat alone in a dimly lit study, the glow of a single lamp casting long shadows across the room. He wasn't president anymore, but tonight, the weight on his shoulders felt heavier than it ever did in the Oval Office. A letter lay open on the desk in front of him, the words scrawled in an uneven hand. "Don't die before your death." He didn't know who sent it or why, but the message gnawed at him, stirring something deep in his gut, a sense that this was no ordinary warning. Barack leaned back in his chair, his eyes scanning the room, every creak of the old house sharpening his nerves. For months he had been haunted by a recurring dream, a dark hallway with no end, a voice calling his name, and a shadow just out of reach. He had dismissed it as stress, as a mind working overtime. But now with this letter, it felt like something more. A sudden knock at the window made him jump. He turned quickly, his heart pounding. Outside, the storm raged, but in the flash of lightning, he saw it, an outline of a figure standing perfectly still in the downpour, staring directly at him. Barack's breath caught in his throat. He didn't recognize the figure, but somehow he knew it was here for him. Before he could move, the lights flickered, and the room plunged into darkness. Barack froze in the darkness, his pulse thundering in his ears. He strained to hear over the storm outside, but the house had fallen unnervingly silent. The figure in the rain was gone, but the uneasy feeling it left behind was impossible to shake. He reached for his phone, only to realize it was no longer on the desk where he'd left it. The study felt smaller now, the walls pressing in. He tried to rationalize what he had seen. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or perhaps exhaustion was playing with his mind. But deep down, he knew better. That figure wasn't just watching, it was waiting. For what, he couldn't say. Barack stood slowly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet. He thought about calling out, but something stopped him. Whoever or whatever was out there didn't feel like it wanted to talk. It felt like it wanted something else. He moved cautiously to the window, peering out into the rain. The street beyond his house was empty, the only movement coming from the swaying trees. Still, the weight of unseen eyes bore down on him. Then, just as he was about to step away, he noticed something in the garden below. There, etched into the muddy earth, was a symbol he didn't recognize, a circle with jagged lines cutting through it. It hadn't been there earlier, he was sure of it. He whispered to himself, "What the hell is going on?" Suddenly, the silence was broken by a low, resonant voice. It wasn't coming from outside, it was behind him. "You were warned, Barack. Now it begins." He spun around, his breath catching in his throat. The room was empty, yet the voice lingered, as though the shadows themselves were alive. Barack's heart raced as he scanned the darkened room, every shadow seeming to stretch and shift unnaturally. The voice had been so clear, so deliberate, but there was no one there. He reached for the lamp on his desk, fumbling to turn it on, only to find that it wouldn't respond. The bulb had gone out, leaving him bathed in the dim, flickering light of the storm outside. His first instinct was to leave the room, to put distance between himself and whatever was happening. But as he stepped toward the door, it slammed shut with a force that shook the walls. Barack stumbled back, his chest tightening as a cold wind swept through the study, though the windows were closed. Then the whispers began, faint at first, like the rustling of leaves, but they grew louder, intertwining into a chorus of disjointed voices. They spoke in fragments, words overlapping in a chaotic symphony. The symbol, the choice, the past, face it. None of it made sense, yet it felt disturbingly personal, as if the voices were speaking directly to his soul. Barack's mind raced. The symbol in the garden, the letter, the dreams. Could it all be connected? He thought back to a decision he'd made years ago, one that had haunted him in ways he rarely allowed himself to admit. Could this be about that? But how? The voices suddenly stopped, plunging the room into a silence so complete it was deafening. Then in the reflection of the window, he saw it, a figure standing behind him. It wasn't the same shadowy outline he'd seen earlier. This one was more distinct, almost human, yet its features were blurred, as though it didn't belong entirely to this world. Before Barack could react, The figure leaned forward, its voice calm but filled with an ominous weight. You've lived a life of purpose, but not all debts can be paid with good intentions. The time has come to settle what you owe. Barack turned, but the figure was gone. The door creaked open on its own, revealing a long, dark hallway that hadn't been there before. Against his better judgment, he felt compelled to follow it. Barack hesitated at the threshold of the impossible hallway. The air was thick, heavy, and carried an almost metallic tang that made him uneasy. He knew he should turn back, leave the house, call someone, anyone, but his feet seemed to move on their own. Each step echoed unnaturally, as though the space stretched endlessly ahead of him. The walls were lined with faint flickering lights that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat, guiding him deeper into the unknown. As he moved forward, memories began to surface, unbidden and vivid. He saw himself as a younger man, standing at a crossroads in his career, a decision hanging over him like a storm cloud. He had always believed he'd made the right choice, the moral choice, but the images swirling around him told a different story. Faces of people he couldn't save, promises left unfulfilled. They blurred together, filling the hallway with whispers of regret. The further he walked, the louder the whispers grew. They weren't just voices anymore. They were accusations, fragments of the past twisted into a haunting melody. "You knew the cost," one voice hissed. "You turned away," another accused. He pressed his hands over his ears, but the voices pierced through, growing louder until they became a deafening roar. Then the hallway abruptly ended, opening into a vast dark chamber. In the center, illuminated by an eerie, shifting light, was the symbol from the garden, now etched into the floor. Standing beside it was the figure from before, clearer now but still not entirely human. Its eyes glowed faintly, filled with both judgment and something almost like pity. "You've reached the point of no return," the figure said, its voice resonating with a power that made the room tremble. "Now choose. Confront the truth or let it consume you." Barack's breath caught as the chamber began to close in, the walls alive with the shadows of his past. The weight of the decision pressed down on him, and he realized this was more than just a moment. It was everything. Barack stood frozen, the figure's words echoing in his mind. The chamber seemed alive now, the symbol on the floor pulsating with a rhythmic glow, casting shifting shadows across the room. The figure stepped closer, its form flickering like static on an old television. "The truth will free you," it said, its voice low and reverberating. "But freedom comes with a price." Barack opened his mouth to speak, to demand answers, but before he could, the ground beneath him shuddered violently. Cracks began to form in the floor, snaking out from the glowing symbol. From the fractures, a deep red light seeped, bathing the room in an unsettling glow. Suddenly, another memory surged forward, but this one wasn't his. It was someone else's, a stranger's pain, a decision that spiraled into loss. He staggered back, clutching his head as more unfamiliar memories flooded in. Faces he didn't know, lives he hadn't lived, yet each felt tied to him in an inexplicable way. He saw a woman crying over a torn photograph, a child clutching a tattered teddy bear, and a man staring at a letter with Barack's name on it. It hit him then. These weren't random visions. They were consequences, ripples from decisions he'd made but had long since buried. "You thought time would erase it," the figure said, its tone sharper now. "But every choice leaves a shadow, and those shadows have come to collect." The light from the cracks grew brighter, and the room shook harder, forcing Barack to his knees. His heart raced as he looked up, meeting the figure's glowing eyes. "You think this is about you?" it asked, stepping closer. "This is bigger than you ever imagined." Before Barack could respond, the walls around him began to dissolve, revealing not just the shadows of his past, but something far darker waiting in the void beyond. Barack's breath came in short, sharp gasps as the walls around him crumbled entirely, leaving him suspended in a vast, infinite void. The glowing cracks beneath him spread wider, forming a swirling vortex of light and shadow. The figure stood at the edge of the chasm, its gaze fixed on him, unmoving yet filled with an overwhelming authority. "This is your moment," it said, its voice resonating from everywhere and nowhere. You've spent your life trying to leave a mark, to make a difference. But in the process, you left behind more than you saved. Now those choices demand balance. Barack's mind raced as he struggled to comprehend. He had always known that no decision came without consequences. But this was something beyond anything he'd ever imagined. "What do you want from me?" he shouted, his voice trembling with both fear and defiance. The figure stepped forward, its form shimmering as it extended a hand. "A sacrifice," it said. "Your legacy, your future, or the lives tied to the choices you ignored. One must be given to restore the balance." Barack stared at the outstretched hand, his heart pounding. He thought of his family, the people who still depended on him, the future he had envisioned. But then the faces from the visions flashed before him, the lives he had unknowingly affected, the pain he had caused without realizing. He closed his eyes, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Finally, he looked up, his resolve hardening. "Take me," he said. "If that's what it takes, I'll pay the price." The figure paused, tilting its head as if surprised. The vortex suddenly stilled, and the chamber seemed to freeze in time. "You've chosen well," it said, a faint smile forming on its otherwise indistinct face. But as the figure reached out, everything shifted. Barack felt himself pulled upward, away from the chasm, away from the void. When his eyes opened, he was back in his study, the letter still on his desk. The house was silent, and everything appeared normal, except for one detail. The symbol was now etched into his palm, glowing faintly, a reminder that some debts are never fully paid. Barack stood in his study, his hands still trembling, as he stared at the faint glow of the symbol on his palm. The storm outside had stopped, and the world beyond the window seemed impossibly quiet. For a moment he wondered if everything had been a nightmare, a dark figment of his imagination brought on by years of stress and self-doubt. But as he looked down at his hand, he knew that wasn't true. The symbol pulsed, a quiet reminder that the choices he had made were not easily erased. He thought back to the figure, the ominous presence that had seemed so intent on pulling him into the darkness. He hadn't truly understood what was at stake until that final moment, when he realized the cost of ignoring his past. In trying to fix the world, he had neglected the very people who needed him the most. His sacrifices, his decisions, had a ripple effect, and for the first time, he saw how far those ripples extended. But now, as the morning light filtered through the windows, a sense of clarity washed over him. He couldn't undo what had been done, but he could face it, learn from it, and move forward. The path ahead wasn't clear, but the weight of the past no longer controlled him. He had chosen to confront the truth, to take responsibility for his actions, no matter the consequences. As the symbol on his palm faded, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. He knew that the journey wasn't over, that the shadows of his past would always be with him. But now they no longer held power over him. Barack took a deep breath, looking out at the world outside, ready to face whatever came next. He had been through the darkness, but now he was free to walk in the light again. And for the first time in a long time, he believed he could make a difference, on his terms, with the knowledge that the past, no matter how dark, was a part of him, not his master.